Imagine a world where the sun seems to disappear and a cold, dark shadow falls over every home. Imagine a time when people who were once friends and neighbors suddenly became afraid to look each other in the eye. This is not a fairy tale or a scary story made up for a movie. This is a true story about one of the saddest and most frightening times in human history. It is the story of how one man's anger and a country's pain turned into a plan to hurt millions of innocent people. We are going to look deep into the past to understand why a man named Adolf Hitler chose to blame and persecute the Jewish people. This journey will take us through old cities, into the middle of great wars, and inside the minds of people who were lost in a sea of lies. It is a story about how hate can grow like a weed in a garden if no one pulls it out. We must tell this story so that we can learn how to keep the world bright and safe for everyone today. It is a journey that is hard to hear, but it is a journey we must take together to make sure that the light of kindness never goes out again. To understand why Hitler did what he did, we have to look back much further than his own life. For hundreds and hundreds of years in Europe, Jewish people were often treated differently than everyone else. This was called anti-Semitism. Long before Hitler was even born, there were many stories and myths about Jewish people that were not true. Some people blamed them for things they did not do, like causing diseases or making the economy bad. Because Jewish people had different traditions, different ways of praying, and sometimes lived in their own small communities, other people felt they were outsiders. This made it easy for leaders who were mean or looking for someone to blame to point their fingers at the Jewish community. Over many centuries, these bad feelings were like a fire that never really went out. It just stayed small, waiting for someone to add more wood to it. By the time Hitler came along, the fire of hatred was already there, and he decided to make it grow into a giant, scary flame that would burn everything down. The man who would cause so much pain was once just a little boy. Adolf Hitler was born in a small town in Austria in 1889. His family was not rich, and his father was a very strict and sometimes mean man. Adolf was a quiet boy who liked to draw and dream about becoming a famous artist. He did not do very well in school, and he often argued with his teachers. When he was a teenager, his mother, who he loved very much, got very sick and died. This made him very sad and very lonely. He felt like the world was a hard and unfair place. He moved to a big city called Vienna, hoping to get into a famous art school. He wanted to show the world that he was special and talented, but the art school told him no. They said his drawings were not good enough. This rejection hurt him deeply. He spent many years living in the streets of Vienna, poor and hungry, watching the world go by and feeling like he was being left behind by the enemies of the German-speaking people. He began to believe that the world was a struggle between different groups of people, and he thought his own group was being treated unfairly. He stopped seeing Jewish people as individuals with feelings and families. Instead, he started to see them as a group that was stopping him and his country from being great. These years in the city changed him from a sad young man into someone who was filled with anger and looking for someone to blame for his own failures. In 1914, a giant war started called World War I. For Hitler, this war felt like a way to finally be part of something big. He joined the army and served as a messenger. He was very brave and even won medals for his service. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had a purpose and a family with the other soldiers. He loved the discipline and the feeling of power that came with being in the military. But the war was very long and very terrible. While Hitler was living in Vienna, he started to listen to the people around him. Vienna was a place where many people were talking about politics and why life was so hard. Some of the leaders in the city at that time used anti-Semitism to get people to vote for them. They told the poor people that the reason they were hungry was because of the Jewish people. Hitler listened to these lies every day. He started to read books and newspapers that said Jewish people, millions of people died, and the world was filled with smoke and pain. In the end, Germany lost the war. When Hitler heard the news, he was in a hospital because he had been hurt by poisonous gas. He cried and felt a deep sense of shame. He could not believe that his strong army had been defeated. He refused to believe that Germany lost because of the fighting on the battlefield. Instead, he started to believe a new lie. After the war ended, many people in Germany were angry and confused. They have lost their pride, their money, and their loved ones. Hitler and some other soldiers started telling a story that said Germany did not really lose the war. They said that the army had been stabbed in the back by people at home. They blamed politicians, people who wanted peace, and most of all, they blamed the Jewish people. This was a giant lie. But it was a lie that many angry people wanted to believe. It was easier to blame a group of people than to admit that the war was just too big to win. Hitler realized that if he told this lie over and over again, people would start to listen to him. He found that he was very good at speaking in front of crowds. He would stand on tables in beer halls and yell about how Germany was cheated and how the Jewish people were to blame for everything wrong in the world. Germany after the war was a very sad place. There was something called the Treaty of Versailles, which was a set of rules the winning countries made Germany follow. These rules made Germany pay a lot of money and take away some of its land. This made the German people very poor. Sometimes, money became so worthless that people needed a whole wagon full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Children were hungry, and parents were scared. When people are that scared and hungry, they often look for a hero to save them. They also look for a villain to blame for their problems. Hitler saw this pain and used it. He promised the people that he would give them jobs, food, and pride again. He told them that they were the best people in the world and that their problems were all caused by the outsiders living among them. Hitler joined a small group of people who felt the same way he did. This group eventually became known as the Nazi Party. They wore uniforms and used a symbol called the swastika. Hitler became the leader of this party because he was such a powerful speaker. He would use simple words and repeat them many times. He told the people that Germany needed to be strong and that they needed to get rid of anyone who was not pure. He spoke about a master race that was better than everyone else. He said that Jewish people were not part of this race and that they were actually trying to destroy Germany from the inside. Many people joined his party because they were tired of being poor and they liked the feeling of being strong and united against an enemy. At one point, Hitler tried to take over the government by force, but he failed and was sent to prison. While he was there, he had a lot of time to write down all his angry ideas. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. In this book, he explained exactly what he wanted to do. He wrote that Jewish people were the biggest threat to the world. He said that they were behind every bad thing, like communism and the loss of the war. He even said that the blood of Germans should not be mixed with the blood of Jewish people. The book was full of hate and crazy ideas, but it became very famous. People read it and started to think that Hitler had the answers to their problems. It laid out a plan for a future where only the strong would survive and where the people he hated would be removed from society. One of the most dangerous things Hitler and his friends used was something called propaganda. This is when you use posters, radio, and movies to tell people what to think. A man named Joseph Goebbels helped Hitler with this. They told the same lies over and over again until people started to think they were true. They showed pictures of Jewish people looking mean or scary. They told children in schools that Jewish people were like germs that made the country sick. They used science that was not real to try and prove that some people were better than others. This was very effective because if you hear a lie every day from the government, the teachers and the radio, it becomes very hard to know what the truth is. People stopped thinking for themselves and started thinking exactly what Hitler wanted them to think. Just when things in Germany were starting to get a little bit better, a giant economic problem called the Great Depression hit the whole world. Banks closed, and millions of people lost their jobs again. This was the perfect chance for Hitler. He told the people that the democratic government was weak and could not help them. He promised that if he were in charge, everyone would have a job and a full stomach. He pointed his finger at the Jewish people again, saying they were the ones who controlled all the money and were making everyone else poor. Because people were so desperate and scared, they voted for the Nazi Party in huge numbers. They felt like they had nothing left to lose, so they chose the man who shouted the loudest and promised the most. In 1933, Hitler finally got what he wanted. He was made the chancellor, which is like being the leader of the country. At first, some people thought they could control him, but they were wrong. As soon as he got power, he started to take it away from everyone else. He got rid of other political parties and made it so that only his ideas were allowed. He used a secret police force called the Gestapo to scare anyone who disagreed with him. If someone spoke out against Hitler, they could be taken away to prison. This made people very afraid to say anything. Hitler was now the absolute ruler, or the Führer, of Germany. He had the power to make his hateful dreams come true, and he started right away by making life very hard for the Jewish people. One of the first things Hitler did was pass laws that took away the rights of Jewish people. These were called the Nuremberg Laws. Imagine waking up one day and being told you are no longer a citizen of your own country. These laws said that Jewish people could not vote, they could not work in government jobs, and they could not marry people who were not Jewish. Jewish doctors were not allowed to treat people who weren't Jewish, and Jewish lawyers could not work in courts. Children were told they could no longer go to school with their friends. It was a slow and cruel process of making Jewish people feel like they did not belong in their own homes. Hitler wanted to make them feel so unwelcome that they would want to leave the country. The hatred turned into physical violence on a terrible night in 1938 called Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. All across Germany and Austria, Nazi supporters attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and places of worship called synagogues. They smashed windows, burned buildings, and hurt many people. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to places called concentration camps just because of who they were. The streets were covered in broken glass that looked like stars on the ground. This night showed the world that Hitler was not just talking about hate. He was acting on it. It was a clear sign that things were going to get much, much worse. After this, it became very difficult for Jewish people to leave the country because many other countries did not want to let them in. In 1939, Hitler's army invaded a country called Poland. This started World War II. Hitler wanted to conquer all of Europe and create a giant empire for the German people. As his army moved into other countries, they brought their hateful rules with them. Everywhere the Nazis went, they rounded up Jewish people. They forced them to wear a yellow star on their clothes so everyone would know who they were. This was meant to shame them and make them easy to find. Hitler's war was not just about land. It was about spreading his ideas and getting rid of the people he didn't like. The war gave him a cover to do things that were even more evil than before because the world was busy fighting and couldn't see everything that was happening. In the countries they conquered, the Nazis forced Jewish people to leave their homes and move into small, crowded areas called ghettos. These were like prisons in the middle of a city. Many families had to live in one tiny room. There was very little food, and people became very thin and sick. The Nazis put walls and barbed wire around the ghettos so no one could leave. Life was very hard, and many people died from hunger and disease. Despite the sadness, people in the ghettos tried to help each other. They started secret schools for children and shared what little food they had. They tried to keep their dignity even when the Nazis were trying to take it away. But the ghettos were only the beginning of a much darker plan. Hitler and his leaders held a secret meeting to decide on what they called the final solution. This was a plan to kill every Jewish person in Europe. They did not want to just make them leave or put them in ghettos anymore. They wanted to erase them from the world. This is one of the most evil plans ever made by humans. They built special camps called death camps that were designed like factories, but instead of making things, they were used to end lives. They used trains to carry people from all over Europe to these camps. The people on the trains were packed together with no food or water for days. Most of them had no idea where they were going or what was going to happen to them. When the trains arrived at the camps, the nightmare became real. Families were torn apart. Mothers were separated from their children, and husbands were separated from their wives. The Nazis took away everything they had, including their clothes, their jewelry, and even their hair. Those who were strong enough were forced to work like slaves in terrible conditions. They were given almost nothing to eat and were treated worse than animals. Those who were too young, too old, or too sick were killed almost immediately. The scale of the killing was so large that it is hard for our minds to even imagine. Millions of people lost their lives in these places of shadow and pain. Even in the middle of all this darkness, there were people who were very brave. Some Jewish people fought back against the Nazis in the ghettos and the camps. One of the most famous fights was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where people used small weapons to fight against a giant army for weeks. There were also people who were not Jewish who risked their own lives to hide Jewish families. They hid them in attics, in basements, and in barns. They shared their food and kept their secrets, knowing that if the Nazis found out, they would be killed too. These people are called righteous among the nations because they showed that kindness and courage can still exist even when the world seems to have gone mad. As the war began to turn against Hitler, the Allied armies, made up of soldiers from countries like the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, started to move into German territory. They began to find the camps and the people who were still alive inside. The soldiers were shocked and heartbroken by what they saw. They found people who were so thin they looked like skeletons. They found the piles of shoes and clothes that belonged to those who were gone. The truth about what Hitler had been doing could no longer be hidden. The world finally saw the full extent of the horror that happens when hate is allowed to rule. The images and stories from the liberation of the camps changed the world forever. By 1945, Hitler's empire was falling apart. The enemy armies were closing in on Berlin, the capital of Germany. Hitler hid in an underground bunker, still refusing to admit he was wrong. He continued to blame the Jewish people for the war and for Germany's defeat until the very end. Rather than face the people he had hurt or be captured by the soldiers, Hitler took his own life. The man who had caused so much suffering died in the dark, leaving behind a country that was destroyed and a world that was grieving. Shortly after his death, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe finally came to an end. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain forever. After the war, the world had to figure out how to move forward. The survivors of the camps had no homes to go back to, and many had lost their entire families. They had to find the strength to build new lives in new places. Many moved to a new country called Israel, while others went to America or other parts of the world. There were trials held in a city called Nuremberg to punish the Nazi leaders for their crimes. This was important because it showed that people cannot just follow orders to do evil things and expect to get away with it. The world promised to never forget what happened, so that it would never happen again. The persecution of the Jewish people by Hitler is now called the Holocaust. It is a word that means a great destruction by fire. About 6 million Jewish people were killed, along with millions of others that the Nazis did not like, such as people with disabilities and people from different ethnic groups. The loss to the world is impossible to measure. We lost doctors, artists, teachers, and millions of children who never got to grow up and share their gifts. The impact of this event is still felt today. We learn about it in school and visit museums so that we can remember the people who were lost and understand the dangers of prejudice and bullying. Looking back, we ask ourselves why Hitler did this. It was a combination of many things. It was a history of old hatred that was never fixed. It was a man who was filled with his own pain and used it to hurt others. It was a country that was so sad and hungry that they stopped listening to their hearts and started listening to a bully. It was the power of lies that were told so often they sounded like the truth. And it was because too many people stayed silent when they saw something wrong happening. Hitler did not do this alone. He needed thousands of people to help him and millions of people to look away. This is the most important lesson we can learn. The story of Hitler and the persecution of the Jewish people teaches us that our choices matter. Every time we choose to be kind instead of mean, we are making the world a little bit brighter. Every time we stand up for someone who is being treated unfairly, we are stopping the shadows from growing. We have to be careful about the stories we believe and the leaders we follow. We must remember that all people, no matter where they come from or what they believe, deserve to be treated with respect and love. Hate is something that is learned, which means love and understanding can be learned too. Even though this story is very sad, there is also light in it. The light is found in the survivors who told their stories so we could learn. The light is in the people who risked everything to help others. The light is in the way the world came together to say that this was wrong. Today, Jewish culture and people continue to thrive and share their traditions with the world. They are a living sign that hate cannot win in the long run. By remembering the past, we are honoring those who were lost and making a promise to the future. We can dream of a world where no one is ever persecuted for who they are. To make that dream come true, we have to be like gardeners. We have to pull out the weeds of hate as soon as we see them. We have to water the seeds of kindness every single day. We have to talk to each other and listen to each other's stories. When we understand someone, it is very hard to hate them. The story of why Hitler persecuted the Jews is a warning. It warns us about what happens when we let anger and lies take over. But we have the power to choose a different path. The journey of history is long and sometimes very difficult to walk, but we walk it so that we can become wiser. We look at the darkest chapters not to become sad, but to become strong. We see how one man's hate tried to destroy the world, and we see how the world eventually pushed back that darkness. The legacy of this story is a call to action for every person. It is a call to be brave, to be truthful, and to be compassionate. As long as we keep the memory of what happened alive, we are building a shield against it ever happening again. As we come to the end of this documentary-style journey, we look back at the path we have traveled. We have seen how ancient prejudices were used by a frustrated man to build a mountain of lies. We have seen how a nation's suffering was twisted into a weapon of war and destruction. We have heard the silent echoes of the millions who were lost in the camps and the ghettos. But we also see the strength of the human spirit that refused to be broken. The story of why Hitler persecuted the Jewish people is a deep and painful scar on our history, but it is also a powerful reminder of our responsibility to one another. We must always speak up against unfairness, always seek the truth behind the words of leaders, and always remember that every single person has a story and a soul. The shadows of the past can only be chased away by the bright light of our shared humanity. Let us carry that light forward into every tomorrow, making sure that the world remains a place of peace, safety, and kindness for all children, everywhere. This is the story of the past, but the story of the future is in our hands. Let us write a future where hate has no home, and where every person is free to shine. Think of a time when the sky itself felt heavy with fear and the very air seemed to hold its breath. Imagine a beautiful garden where suddenly someone decides that certain flowers do not belong and must be pulled out by their roots. This is not a story of a natural disaster or a monster from a legend, but a story of how a real man used real words to turn a whole country against a group of innocent people. We are looking into a dark mirror of the past to understand a question that still hurts to ask. Why did Adolf Hitler decide to hurt the Jewish people? To find the answer, we must travel through the dusty streets of old Europe, listen to the loud shouting of politicians, and look into the eyes of children who were told they were not wanted. This is a journey into the heart of a great darkness, but it is also a search for the light of truth. We must tell this story with care and honesty so that we can understand how to protect the world from such hate ever again. It is a story that begins in small rooms and ends in giant tragedies, changing the world in ways that still matter to every one of us today. One of the ways Hitler started his plan was by using symbols to make people feel like they belonged to a special club. He took a very old symbol called the swastika and turned it into something that people would fear. He put this symbol on giant red flags and hung them from every building in Germany. He wanted people to feel like they were part of a huge, strong team. When people see the same symbol everywhere, they start to feel like they are all the same, and they begin to look at anyone who doesn't have that symbol as an outsider. Hitler used these flags to create a feeling of excitement and power. He made sure that the red, white, and black colors were seen in every parade and on every street corner. This was the beginning of making people feel that being German meant being part of his specific group, and that anyone who was different, especially Jewish people, was not part of the team. It was a clever and mean way to make people feel united by making them feel better than everyone else. Hitler knew that if he wanted his ideas to last forever, he had to change the way children thought. He changed the books in schools so that they told lies about history and science. Teachers were told they had to teach children that the German people were a master race and that Jewish people were dangerous and sneaky. Imagine a little boy or girl sitting in a desk, looking at a chalkboard where the teacher is drawing pictures that make Jewish people look like monsters. These children were told that their Jewish neighbors were the reason their parents were poor or why the country had lost the war. They were even taught fake science that said you could tell if someone was a good person just by measuring the shape of their nose or the color of their eyes. Because the children trusted their teachers, they started to believe these terrible lies. This was one of the saddest parts of the story, because it stole the kindness out of the hearts of young people before they were old enough to know the truth for themselves. During this time, a new invention called the radio was becoming very popular. Hitler and his friend Joseph Goebbels realized that they could use the radio to put Hitler's voice inside every living room in Germany. They made sure that radios were sold very cheaply so that every family could afford one. These radios were nicknamed the People's Receiver. Every day, the radio would play stirring music, and then Hitler would come on and speak for a long time. He used his voice like an actor, sometimes whispering and sometimes shouting. He told the people that they were special, and that the Jewish people were trying to steal their future. Because people heard this in their own homes while they were eating dinner or relaxing, it started to feel like the truth. They didn't have the internet or many other ways to check if what he was saying was real. The radio became a magic box that spread poison into the minds of millions of people all at once. Hitler also loved movies and used them to spread his message. He had people make films that showed the Nazi party looking beautiful and strong. These movies showed thousands of soldiers marching in perfect lines with bright lights shining up into the sky. It looked like a giant, exciting show. At the same time, they made movies that showed Jewish people in very bad ways. They would show them as being dirty or greedy, using actors and costumes to make them look as scary as possible. When people went to the cinema to have fun, they were forced to watch these movies first. It was a way to make the hatred feel like entertainment. By making the Jewish people look like villains in a movie, Hitler made it easier for people to treat them like villains in real life. He wanted to make sure that no matter where people looked, they saw his version of the world. Hitler had a very strange and wrong idea that people were like different types of animals, and he thought his type was the best. He called this the Aryan race. He told the German people that they were taller, stronger, and smarter than everyone else in the world. He said that their blood was pure and that it must never be mixed with the blood of others. He especially targeted the Jewish people, saying that they were the opposite of the master race. This was all based on fake science and made-up stories. He used this idea to make people feel proud of things they didn't even do, like the color of their hair or eyes. By making people feel like they were born better than others, he made them feel like they had the right to be mean to those they thought were lower than them. This was the foundation of all his cruel laws and actions. To make sure no one complained about his treatment of the Jews, Hitler created a group of secret police called the Gestapo. These men wore long coats and walked the streets, listening to what people said. If someone said they thought the Jewish people were being treated unfairly, the Gestapo might knock on their door in the middle of the night. People became very afraid to speak their minds. Even children were sometimes encouraged to tell on their parents if they heard them saying anything bad about Hitler. This atmosphere of fear meant that even people who knew that hurting the Jews was wrong were too scared to do anything about it. The Gestapo made it so that the only voice that could be heard in the whole country was Hitler's voice. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors, and the whole country became like a giant prison where everyone was watching everyone else. Slowly but surely, Hitler started to take away everything that Jewish people owned. First, he said they couldn't work in certain jobs. Then he said they couldn't own stores. He sent his soldiers to stand outside Jewish shops with signs telling people not to buy anything there. He wanted to make the Jewish people so poor that they would have to leave. Eventually, the government just took their houses, their money, and even their furniture. Families who had lived in the same house for 100 years were told they had to leave with only one suitcase. All their beautiful things were given to Nazi supporters or sold. This was a way to humiliate the Jewish people and make them feel like they were not human beings with rights. By taking away their things, Hitler was trying to take away their place in society. In 1936, Hitler held a giant sporting event called the Olympics in the city of Berlin. He wanted to show the whole world how great and modern Germany had become under his rule. For a little while, he told his followers to hide the signs that said mean things about Jewish people. He wanted to trick the other countries into thinking that everything was normal. Many people from all over the world came to watch the games. Some people saw the truth, but many others were impressed by the big stadiums and the beautiful parades. However, a brave African-American runner named Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals, which proved that Hitler's idea of a master race was totally wrong. Even though Hitler tried to use the Olympics to spread his lies, the bravery and skill of the athletes showed that greatness has nothing to do with what group you belong to. As things got worse, many Jewish people tried to leave Germany to go to other countries like America, England, or France. But it was very hard to get away. Many countries had rules that only allowed a few people to enter each year. There was a very sad story of a ship called the St. Louis that was full of Jewish people looking for a safe home. They sailed all the way across the ocean, but no country would let them land. They had to turn around and go back to Europe, where many of them were later caught by the Nazis. It was a time when the world felt very small and very cold. The Jewish people felt like they were trapped in a room with the walls closing in, and no one was reaching out to help them. This loneliness was part of Hitler's plan to make them feel completely abandoned. Hitler did not just hate people. He also hated ideas that were different from his own. He ordered his followers to go to libraries and universities and take all the books written by Jewish authors or people who talked about peace and freedom. They piled these books up in huge heaps in the middle of the squares and set them on fire. Thousands of people watched as the beautiful words of poets and scientists turned to ash. Hitler wanted to destroy the memory of Jewish achievements. He wanted to make sure that the only things people could read were his own books and newspapers. This was a way to burn away the truth so that only his lies remained. It was a warning that when people start burning books, they will soon start hurting people. When the war started and Hitler's army took over other countries, they created places called ghettos. These were crowded parts of cities where Jewish people were forced to live. They built high walls and put up barbed wire so no one could get in or out. Inside the ghettos, there were too many people and not enough of anything else. People had to sleep on the floor and eat scraps of food. Even though it was a place of great suffering, the Jewish people inside did amazing things to stay strong. They shared their food with hungry children and secretly taught classes so the kids wouldn't forget how to read. They sang songs and told stories to keep their spirits alive. Even behind stone walls and iron wires, they showed that their hearts were still free. The Nazis used trains to move Jewish people from the ghettos to the camps. These were not normal trains with seats and windows. They were cattle cars used for animals. They would cram 100 people into one tiny car with no place to sit and no air to breathe. The doors were locked from the outside with heavy iron bars. These trains would travel for days and nights through the cold and the rain. People didn't know where they were going, or if they would ever see their homes again. It was a journey of total darkness. The Nazis used these trains like a conveyor belt to move people toward the final, most terrible part of their plan. The sound of the train whistles became a sound of fear for everyone who heard it. While millions of people were suffering, the leaders of the Nazi Party held a meeting in a fancy house by a lake called Wannsee. They sat at big tables with papers and pens and talked about how to kill all the Jewish people as if they were talking about building a road or fixing a bridge. They used very dry, business-like words to describe a plan that was pure evil. They didn't see the people they were talking about as human beings with names and faces. They saw them as a problem to be solved. This meeting showed how cold and heartless the Nazi leaders had become. They had turned hatred into a government job. And they were very organized about their cruelty. In every country that Hitler took over, there were brave people who joined the underground resistance. These were ordinary people like shopkeepers, farmers, and students who decided to fight back in secret. They would hide Jewish families in their attics or help them sneak across the mountains to safety. Some people made fake identity cards so that Jewish people could pretend to be someone else. They risked their lives every single day because they knew that doing the right thing was more important than staying safe. One famous man named Oskar Schindler used his factory to save more than 1,000 people by telling the Nazis they were needed for work. These stories of bravery remind us that even when things are at their darkest, there are always people who will stand up for what is right. One of the most famous stories from this time is about a young girl named Anne Frank. She and her family hid in a secret room behind a bookshelf in a house in Amsterdam for 2 whole years. While she was there, she wrote in a diary about her dreams, her fears, and her hope that the world would one day be kind again. She was just a regular teenager who liked movies and wanted to be a writer. Her diary was found after the war and has been read by millions of people all over the world. Her words give a voice to the millions of children who were silenced by Hitler. She showed that even in hiding, a person can have a beautiful and powerful mind that hate cannot touch. One of the hardest things to understand about this time is why so many people let it happen. Many people were not Nazis, but they also didn't do anything to stop the Nazis. They watched as their Jewish neighbors were taken away and said nothing. Some were afraid for their own safety, while others just didn't want to get involved. This silence was like a big blanket that covered the whole country, allowing the evil to grow. It teaches us that being a bystander can be just as dangerous as being a bully. When we see someone being hurt, our silence can actually help the person doing the hurting. This is a lesson that we must always remember in our own lives today. When the war was finally ending, soldiers from the Allied countries began to find the camps that Hitler had hidden in the woods and the countryside. They were not prepared for the horror they found. They found thousands of people who were so weak they could barely stand. They found the machines the Nazis had used to carry out their final solution. The soldiers, many of whom were tough men who had seen a lot of fighting, sat down and cried when they saw what had been done. They realized that they were not just fighting a war for land, but they were fighting a war to save humanity itself. They worked as fast as they could to give the survivors food and medicine, but for many, it was already too late. After the war ended, the world decided that the people who had done these terrible things had to be punished. They held the Nuremberg trials, where the leaders of the Nazi Party had to stand in front of judges and answer for their crimes. For the first time in history, the world said that just following orders was not an excuse for being evil. These trials were very important because they showed that there are laws that are higher than the laws of any one country. They made it clear that every human being has a right to life and that no leader can take that away. It was a way to start bringing a little bit of balance back to a world that had been turned upside down. The people who survived the Holocaust had to find the courage to start over. Most of them had lost their moms, dads, brothers, and sisters. They had no money and no homes. Many of them traveled across the world to start new lives in places like Israel, the United States, or Australia. They carried their memories with them, but they also carried a great strength. They got married, had children, and built new businesses and communities. They showed the world that even after the most terrible fire, new life can grow. Their stories of survival are some of the most inspiring stories in all of human history. We study the story of why Hitler persecuted the Jews so that we can recognize the warning signs of hate in our own time. We learn that it starts with small things, like calling people names or telling mean jokes. It grows when we stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them only as part of a group we don't like. We learn that we must always stand up for the truth and never let lies go unchallenged. Most of all, we learn that every person has a responsibility to be kind and to protect the rights of others. The history of the Holocaust is a heavy burden to carry, but it is also a powerful tool that helps us build a better world. In many cities around the world, there are now memorials and museums dedicated to the Holocaust. These are places where we can go to remember the names and the faces of those who were lost. Some memorials are just simple stones in the sidewalk with the names of people who used to live in those houses. These places remind us that history is not just about kings and wars, but about real people who had lives just like ours. By visiting these places and saying their names, we are making sure that Hitler did not win. He wanted to erase these people from the world, but by remembering them, we are keeping them alive in our hearts and in our history. The conclusion of this journey is not just the end of a script, but the beginning of a promise. It is a promise that we will look at the world with eyes of love instead of eyes of hate. It is a promise that we will listen to the voices of the past so that we can speak more clearly in the present. The story of why Hitler persecuted the Jews shows us the very worst that humans can do, but the story of how the world responded shows us the very best we can be. We are the keepers of this history now. It is up to us to make sure that the shadow of the swastika is replaced by the light of understanding. Let us walk together into a future where every person is celebrated for who they are, and where the word hate is something we only read about in history books, never to be seen in our streets again. This is the ultimate victory over the darkness of the past. The story is told, the lesson is learned, and now the future belongs to the kind, the brave, and the true.